In the retail industry, two of the biggest beneficiaries of the pandemic this last year have been the e-commerce industry and the grocery industry. So what about grocery e-commerce? Well, obviously it's exploding, but not without some of its own challenges. Grab a coffee and let's get into it. Now? Sorry about that. Hey, I'm Jason Retailgeek Goldberg. I'm a fourth-generation retailer. I'm the Chief Commerce Strategy Officer for the Publicis Groupe, so I work with many of the largest brands and retailers in the world. This channel offers weekly quick hits and then the occasional deep dive on the latest trends and news in the e-commerce industry. Today we're going to talk about digital grocery, how fast it's growing, some of the challenges around profitability and what retailers are doing about it, and what might be next and what digital grocery might look like in the years to come. Let's start off with a recap. When we've talked about the pandemic in the past, we've talked about two of the biggest beneficiaries being the e-commerce industry, which grew faster than any other segment of retail, and the grocery industry, which also was in the top 3 segments of all growth. So it won't come as a surprise to anyone that a lot of people learned how to buy their bananas online as a result of the pandemic. Now, we don't have great data on exactly how big the e-commerce industry is. The U.S. Department of Commerce doesn't track e-commerce specific to grocery, for example, so we have to rely on a lot of surveys and third-party data collection methods to try to estimate it. But in general, before the pandemic, digital grocery in the United States was very small. It probably represented less than 3 to 4% of all grocery spending. And the bulk of that is going to be on dry, shelf-stable goods. The amount of fresh food and frozen food sold via e-commerce would be even much smaller. But after a year of the pandemic, our best estimates are that over 10% of all grocery spending might now be online. And a lot of that is likely to be permanent. So if we look at some of the forecasts for digital grocery before the pandemic and compare them to where we actually are after the pandemic, or at least after the bulk of the pandemic, knock on wood, we'll see that we literally are 5 years ahead of our original forecast. So digital grocery is one of those places where the pandemic literally did accelerate us 5 years into the future. And if we compare the rates of growth of online grocery versus in-store grocery, you can see that before the pandemic, online grocery was already growing pretty rapidly in that sort of 50 to 75% a year range. But as a result of the pandemic, online grocery has been growing at like 150% a year. So a huge acceleration. And when we look at a lot of the big public grocers and we look at what they've told us their e-commerce grew over the last 3 quarters, you can see a lot of them are even outperforming the industry average. So a ton of growth. E-commerce grocery is accelerating and everybody is trying to deal with it. Now, one of the reasons it's accelerating is because obviously restaurants were big losers in the pandemic. It's interesting to look at how much money consumers spent on calories at restaurants versus grocery stores before the pandemic. And for the 12 months leading up to last March, on average, consumers spent about half of their calorie budget at restaurants and half of their calorie budget at grocery stores. And then the pandemic hit, we all stopped eating meals out, so we either got delivery meals from restaurants or we bought more food from grocery stores. And so at the peak of the pandemic, we spent about 70% of our calorie budget at grocery stores. And then, after the first 2 or 3 months of the pandemic, it sort of leveled out to about 60% of our budget going to grocery stores and 40% of our budget going to restaurants. So grocery stores have been a huge beneficiary of this extra spending as people haven't been able to spend as much on restaurants. And of course, the bulk of that grocery spending has been in e-commerce as people have done curbside pickup and home delivery of their groceries during the pandemic. Now, one huge challenge with all this growth is that selling groceries online has not been particularly profitable for American grocers. So before the pandemic, a lot of the big grocers were really leaning into digital grocery, and they were trying to figure out how to win. They were trying to figure out how to compete with the threat they perceived was coming from Amazon, but they really weren't focused on profitability, and it was such a small piece of their sales that the big grocers probably didn't care that much that it wasn't profitable. But now that e-commerce grocery is 10% of a grocer's sales, having those sales be profitable becomes a big deal. And two problems we have to remember in online grocery are that there's two big costs associated with groceries that the consumer paid for in a traditional grocery trip that they expect the retailer to pay for in an e-commerce trip. In the old world, when you'd go to the grocery store, you provided the labor to pick that 60 to 120 items that you put in that cart. You were literally the picker, and then you paid the labor to drive those groceries home to your house. So you provided the picking and you provided the delivery. But in e-commerce, you expect someone else to pick all those groceries for you, and you often expect them to deliver those groceries to you, and you don't like to pay more for those two services. So that really has put a strain on the profitability of e-commerce grocery. So what are grocers doing about it? Well, they're trying to defray those two costs. So in terms of the delivery costs, it turns out in the United States that consumers are generally very happy to drive by the grocery store and pick their groceries up. Even before their pandemic, curbside pickup was the fastest growing part of grocery. And during the pandemic, the top 6 retailers in the United States saw their curbside pickup sales grow by 130%. Those curbside orders represented 50% of all e-commerce. And that was particularly true in grocery. If we look at the breakdown of grocery orders that were delivered, you can see that about 75% or more of all grocery orders are for curbside pickup. And these curbside pickup experiences that Kroger offered, that they call Quick List, or what Walmart called online grocery pickup, are some of the highest NPS score customer experiences that those retailers have ever tested. In the United States, the majority of grocery tends to be curbside pickup, and that's one of the ways retailers can make online grocery more profitable. And in the bulk of the United States, we just don't have the population density to really make the grocery home delivery profitable. There certainly are markets like Fresh Direct in New York City, for example, where the density probably is there for delivery. And there certainly is a small segment of customers that are willing to pay a premium for the convenience of home delivery. But for the bulk of Americans, it looks like curbside pickup is going to be the winning flavor of digital grocery. The other problem we talked about is that cost associated with picking the groceries. Paying someone to run around that retail store, find all those items, and put it in the cart. And so the best way to save that cost for a retailer is to automate that, right? And so the industry has invented a system that they call micro-fulfillment centers. And these are sort of miniaturized versions of the robotics that the e-commerce sites use in their big fulfillment centers that are optimized for grocery. So they tend to be smaller. They usually have 2 or 3 climate zones. So maybe I have an ambient temperature or a refrigerated temperature and a frozen temperature. And in the case of Walmart, they're piloting putting these micro-fulfillment centers in the parking lots of existing Walmart stores. So they'd stock the most popular items. The robot inside this micro-fulfillment center would pick all those items at generally about 1/10 the cost that we'd have to pay a person to run around a store and pick all those orders. Almost every major grocer is testing some flavor of this. I mentioned Walmart's testing them in the parking lot. In Safeway Albertsons' case, they're actually shrinking the live grocery store to put these micro-fulfillment centers in the back of existing grocery stores. So this is another example of automating the picking and optimizing the store for digital grocery, whereas before the store was optimized for in-person grocery shopping. So these kinds of micro-fulfillment centers are really one of the main ways retailers are hoping to defray the picking costs. Now, most grocers still think the majority of those groceries get delivered from an individual store to a customer, and they're just trying to make the picking and delivery more efficient. In other countries, like in the UK, the density is there that it often makes sense to have all these groceries in a central distribution center and then deliver the groceries from a dedicated distribution center instead of from an individual store. So that's the model that Ocado uses in the UK. Fresh Direct uses that model here in the US. And Kroger is partnered with Ocado to try that model here in the US. So this is a photograph from one of the first Kroger grocery distribution centers in the US. This opened in a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, and this is called the Kroger Shed. This is about a 325,000 square foot fulfillment center, so much bigger than these kind of 5 to 15,000 square foot micro fulfillment centers. And this reportedly cost $55 million to build. So a much more expensive, bigger bet. And it has to be able to deliver a lot more grocery orders to a lot more customers than one of these micro-fulfillment centers to pencil out. So we're sort of seeing these two models play out in the US, with some grocers betting on centralized distribution centers, some grocers betting on the micro-fulfillment centers in the individual stores as distribution centers. This is an example of the inside of that giant Kroger shed, so you can see much more expansive than the smaller micro-fulfillment centers that we're looking at from the other retailers. Another big problem with profitability of digital grocery is the impulse purchase problem. So when you go to a grocery store, you may have a list, but you tend to buy a lot of things that aren't on your list. You probably had to walk by the Oreos on the way to the milk. You may have discovered a new salty snack that you wanted to try. And for sure, you were standing in line to pay behind 3.5 other people, and you were staring at that gum and candy and cold sodas. So you added a lot of unplanned purchases to your trip, and all those purchases are an important part of the profitability model for a grocer. But when you shop digitally, you tend to order off a list. You tend to use the retailer search engine, you build a list, and then after that first order, you tend to repeat the previous order, and maybe you manicure that list a little bit, but you don't discover new products that you didn't know you wanted to buy, and you don't make those impulse purchases at the end of the shopping trip. So grocers are having to experiment with digital ways to drive impulse purchases that we used to get in the store, right? And the working theory is there's really 3 touch points where we might be able to do this. In the list building process on your mobile phone or your web browser, we can have a top-off experience. So we can recommend products that you weren't looking for based on your shopping behaviors or what you already have in your cart, and hope to get you to top off your order with additional unplanned purchases. This is sort of the most traditional e-commerce way of driving unplanned purchases. But I mentioned that a lot of these orders are picked up curbside from the store. So another touch point we have for driving digital impulse is to have surprise items available for adding to your order right at the curbside where you come to pick up that grocery order. So maybe we have a menu of impulse items, and we might even have an inventory of those items available, and we can just add them to your existing order. And so you can take that can of Coke to drink on your way home from picking up your grocery order and kind of drive impulse that way. And the third idea is that maybe we have to start putting more samples in the bag that you take home. And maybe you discover items not right before you buy, but right after you buy and you get home. And maybe we can use QR codes or some other mechanism to make it easy to add those impulse items that you liked to your list for future purchases. So we've actually seen Sam's Club start to roll out a formal sampling program in bag for customers to take home and discover in their kitchens instead of on the shelf in the retail store. So those are sort of the working theories on how we solve impulse. There's another big challenge, though, if you're a CPG that sells through grocery stores. About 25% of all grocery stores are independent owner-operators, small mom-and-pop stores, and they're really economically in jeopardy as a result of the pandemic. So on average, those grocers tended to have about 19 days of cash on hand before the pandemic, and so if they have a significant disruption, if they lose business to a big grocer that has a more digitally enabled shopping experience or a broader assortment or better pricing, it's a very short trip to an inflection point where that independent grocer goes out of business. And so there's some hypothesis that as many as 25% of all grocery stores could close. And think about the impact that has on a big brand that sells through grocery stores. We already have pretty significant concentration. The top 3 grocers in the US are Walmart, Kroger, and Albertsons. And together, those 3 grocers represent about 40% of the grocery market. So if you're a food brand or a CPG brand, Walmart, Kroger, and Albertsons represent about 40% of your customer base. And so they have a lot of power and leverage over you to negotiate business terms. But if 25% of those independent stores close, then look at what happens to that concentration. A lot more orders shift to those 3 big grocers, and now those top 3 grocers represent 62% of all your purchases. So suddenly they're expecting better credit terms, they're expecting more co-op, they're expecting you to invest more in their retail media programs. They're just adding a lot of costs back to the brands, and that's another way that the big grocers can kind of address the profitability of digital grocery, is get the brands to spend more, and they'll be more successful in doing that the more consolidation there is in the industry. There's another reason that we're seeing consolidation in the grocery industry. As a result of the pandemic, consumers are using fewer stores to fulfill all their food needs than they did before the pandemic. Maybe before the pandemic you got your alcohol at Total Wine & More, you got your fresh produce from Whole Foods, and you got your shelf-stable items from Kroger. But during the pandemic, in order to minimize trips, what you did is you went to one place that could sell all those things. So maybe Kroger and Walmart with a full assortment of all those things, 1 trips, and maybe smaller grocers like Trader Joe's or specialty grocers lost trips, right? And so almost every brand and retailer saw this significant consolidation. At Walmart in Q4, the number of transactions in the store was down 14%. 14% fewer people walked in the store and bought something, but their sales went up 27% because each customer that went to the store bought more stuff. Walmart was a net winner in trips. Kroger was a net winner in trips. A lot of those small independent grocers and specialty grocers were a net loser in trips. And so that's another reason that we're seeing consolidation, and that has a big impact on all the brands that try to sell through those retailers. Another interesting thing to think about as we get towards the end of the pandemic is that now we have a lot more consumers that know how to shop digitally. And many of those will continue to buy digitally, but some of those will return to the store, at least for some of their grocery items, right? We'll probably have more mixed customers than we did before that do some missions online, some missions in the store. But even when they visit the store, they're going to be more digitally savvy than they ever were before. And so every major grocer is now scrambling to reinvent their in-store experience for a more digitally savvy consumer. So this is Amazon Fresh. This is a new built-from-scratch grocery concept that Amazon's rolling out. I think there's about 27 of these in the US right now. There are rumors that they're planning to scale it very quickly. And look at some of the amenities that they have in this store. They have a smart dash cart that has merchandising and product information on a digital screen that's built into your shopping cart as you move around the store. They have Alexa for wayfinding and product information on the shelf edge as you walk around the store. And most interestingly to me, they've replaced all the paper price tags with digital fact tags. And these are always updated with the latest prices, so the store can have much more dynamic pricing. But even more interesting, these digital fact tags also prominently feature how many ratings and reviews and what the average star rating is for every item in the store. We know online that those ratings and reviews are the most persuasive attribute in terms of what products get purchased and what products don't. And now grocers are starting to make that information available in the physical store to these digitally savvy shoppers. So it may be that collecting ratings and reviews for products, and particularly for new products, which is hard to do, becomes much more important to a brand to signal their future success than it did before the pandemic, right? And this Amazon Fresh store will feel very familiar to global grocery shoppers. If you go to the interesting new grocery concepts in China, this is Hema, which is Fresh Hippo. It's a digital grocery store invented by Alibaba. This is 7Fresh, which is from one of the biggest pure play e-commerce sites in China called JD.com. And both of these are digitally native grocery stores that have a lot of the same digital amenities that we're seeing at this Amazon store. And in China, what we see is that customers tend to make fewer visits to the store, and then they use the list they built in the store with that in-person shop to reorder those items for home delivery. And so this kind of digital first grocery store was born in China, and we're now seeing a lot of American grocery stores sort of evolve in the same way. So far, the bulk of energy in the digital grocery space has been spent on these big shopping trips. These big stock ups where customers buy 60 to 120 items. They're the most profitable shopping trip. So if you can win a trip, that's really the trip you want to win. So it makes sense that that's where grocers started. But we're now starting to see businesses go after another important part of the grocery industry, the top-off trip. So if you think about all those corner grocers and bodegas and things with a very limited assortment, they weren't really impacted by these huge changes to the top-up trip. They, of course, did have less visits because of the pandemic, but they really don't compete for that 60-item grocery trip. They compete for the 3 things that you're out of that night, or the thing you need on your way home for that night's dinner. And so they've been a little more digitally immune than the big stock-up trip, but that is now changing. We've seen some digitally native companies like Groupe that are really focused on this top-up trip, right? And so they're building out fulfillment centers in every neighborhood where they're stocking their own inventory of items that they can deliver sometimes in half an hour, and really competing with that bodega for these top-offs and small orders. If we ever go back to the office, the snacks for the staff meeting at your office, all of these sorts of things. And who's competing for that business with GoPuff? Well, the big home delivery services, the Uber Eats, the DoorDashes that have this infrastructure for delivering single meals to consumers. They're rapidly investing in delivering top-off groceries to consumers as well. And so it probably won't come as a surprise to anyone that we now understand that Amazon is also interested in this top-off business. And so we've gotten an indication that they're starting to build a new kind of regional fulfillment center to just stock these fast-turn top-off items to be able to potentially deliver them in as short as 30 minutes to consumers. So this particular one is here in a suburb of Chicago where I live. And it seems like that is going to be one of the big new battlegrounds for digital grocery as we go forward. So in the highly unlikely event that you didn't just get enough of me, I have great news. There's more than 300 additional hours of me on the interweb. That's right, the Jason Scot Show is a weekly e-commerce podcast. My much smarter co-host Scott Wingo and I have been doing it for about 5 years, and we go into great depth in topics like this every week on the podcast. Scott's parents spelled his name wrong, so you can search for Scott with just 1 T wherever you get your podcasts, and we sure would appreciate it if you'd join us and give it a listen. I do hope this video was helpful. If you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'd also love to know what other topics and videos you'd like to see. You can really help me by clicking the like button and subscribing to my channel. That helps my content get amplified on the YouTube platform. And until next time, happy commercing.